Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the session on women's representation. During this session, we'll hear from each panel member and then the floor will be open to questions. The aim of this session is to inspire, encourage and support women to use the democratic processes that are out there to put ourselves back in the heads of our representatives, because at the moment they're ignoring us, despite the fact that we're 51% of the population. No doubt they'll come knocking on our doors begging for our votes over the coming months. And I would like to say to everybody, don't put up with their bullshit. Asking them what is a woman is a valid question, because what we've learned is that many of them are either too craven to say what a woman is, or some of them actually believe that anybody can be a woman. And do you want to elect people that are so far removed from reality? I would suggest no. So please, seek out your candidates, every one of them, and interrogate them, because they're there to represent us. The way that politics has gone recently in Scotland, it seems a little bit that they've forgotten what the purpose is. They're public servants. That's what they are. And I am delighted to, if a little bit, a bit of an imposter syndrome up here with 4 absolutely amazing women, 2 former politicians and 2 present politicians. Each one of them have put their head above the parapet, and each one of them have had many, many shots fired at them. But thankfully, like all strong women, they're still here and they're still fighting. I think it's time that we not only demanded better from our politicians, but join them in their place of work to remind them that they're supposed to represent us, and not just a minority of loud, angry activists, often funded by the public purse. And I think Rona hit the nail on the head when she said that we need to reclaim back our words, especially safety, because I'm sick and tired of politicians talking about this poor, marginalised demographic that are so afraid of women's words. They're so afraid that they came to, why do they follow us around? They came to Dundee last weekend and we were faced with a barrage of abuse. Women were spat at as we exited the square. That's not the actions of people that are scared of us. Now, some politicians seem to be taken in by this line, but anybody that has any ability for critical thinking, surely they must be asking themselves, well, if they're afraid of women's words, why are they following them around the country? So, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce our panel. So to my far left, we've got Ash Regan. And not that she needs any introduction, but Joanna Rebel Cherry. And I am particularly delighted to be able to introduce our next panel member, because she was a huge inspiration and a huge support when I was a young Green councillor and had just been elected, and I was raging about what I was seeing, but I also knew I needed to be careful about how I phrased and said things. And I have to say, Joan McAlpine was an absolute strength. So please welcome Joan. And last, but by no means least, back 10 years ago, I would have said, if you told me I'd be sitting on a panel as an independent supporter with Johann Lamont, I would have laughed myself sick. But purity politics is a real problem in our country. And I have learned the hard way that we may not agree on everything, but we must find common ground and focus on that. And if anybody had said to me that watching Johann Lamont's final speech in Parliament that I'd be crying like a baby, again, I would be laughing at them. But that's exactly what happened. So please, put your hands together and welcome Johann Lamont. So I'm going to hand over to Joanna Cherry.
Thanks, Caroline. It is lovely to be introduced by you because you were such an amazing support to me while you were still in the SNP and such a tower of strength in some of the battles that we faced, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. It's also really great to share a platform with Joanne. When I got involved in politics 10 years ago, during and after the referendum, one of the things I really wanted to see was to see feminists who supported independence, and particularly on the left, and feminists on the left who didn't support independence, to find a way to come back together again. We certainly have, but not quite in the way I anticipated, but I think gender-critical politics has helped us reunite as a force across the parties, and that has been a really good thing. As somebody who's on the left of politics, that really matters to me for the left, but I think we have to acknowledge there have been some unlikely allies on the right as well. I don't mean the far right, obviously, but I'm thinking about centre-right Tories. Some of them have stuck up for women's rights, and that deserves to be acknowledged. Anyway, it's really great to be back in Alloa and lovely to be invited. It's a particular pleasure to be here in the constituency of my colleague John Nicholson. John, no, not anyone can be a lesbian. Lesbians don't have penises, and that's just the way that it is, and I'd thank you to remember that. So I suppose I just want to talk a little bit about our politics, where it is in Scotland, particularly from a women's perspective. But I attended quite an interesting event the other night, which was marking 25 years of the Scottish Parliament, and it was a podcast, Hollywood Sources podcast, which they were doing live, and they had various people who'd been involved in the Scottish Parliament over the years. And there was a very strong view, cross-party, from nationalist politicians, Labour politicians, and one Tory politician who took part, and a Lib Dem, I think, as well, that there's a problem with the Scottish Parliament in that an awful lot of the members of the Scottish Parliament come from one background, which is a background of having been a student politician, a politician's bag carrier, a councillor, and then an MSP. Not that there's anything wrong with any of those things, but the point is that they've not had any experience out with politics. Now, obviously, I would say that, wouldn't I? Because I didn't become an MP till I was 49, and I'd been a lawyer for years. But I'm not, and it's quite a typical. There's many politicians who are lawyers. I'm not talking necessarily about the professions or business. I'm just talking about people with experience of life out with politics, workplaces out with politics. For many years, we used to go on about how politics was very middle class and people came from a certain background. I think that's still a problem, but there are quite a fair number of people who are politicians in Scotland who are from working class backgrounds. But the problem now, I think, more is that people are just from this homogenous political background, and they don't have life experience, and also they don't think for themselves. They're far too wedded to the party line. And I'm going to steal a great line that Fergus Ewing said at this podcast the other night, because I'm going to put it on my leaflets. Fergus said, "If my constituents had wanted a doormat, they would have gone to B&Q." And I thought that was a really good line. So I think there's room for more independent-minded thinking in politics. But to be honest with you, when I got involved during the independence referendum and then put myself forward to be an SNP candidate, almost exactly this time 10 years ago, I had, my intention in getting involved in elected politics, particularly after my side lost the referendum, was to make sure that Scotland had a strong voice at Westminster and to prepare the way for a second independence referendum. In my naivety, I thought that a lot of the feminist battles had been won, and I thought that as a lesbian, I thought the battles for my equality and my lesbian sisters' equality and respect had been won. And it wasn't until I was maybe a couple of years into my career as an MP that I began to become aware of the issue of gender identity ideology. And in fact, one of the things that really made me decide to do something about it was I was at a Women for Independence, people who know will know about them, a Christmas party quite a few years ago, and a woman at the party gave me a letter in a sealed envelope and said, "I'd like you to read this letter when you get home." And I read it, and she explained to me in detail her concerns about gender identity ideology and her anger that no elected parliamentarians were saying anything about it. And so I started to think about it a bit, and then I heard about Women's Place UK had just been set up, and I had heard that they had been in the Westminster Parliament trying to speak to female Labour MPs, and that basically the Labour staffers, and it quite often is the staffers who are more woke than the actual parliamentarians, had clyped on their MPs, and there had been this huge outbreak of a transphobic group has been in Parliament. So when they came to see me in Parliament, my Chief of Staff, who's a man, but people know him, Fraser, he's a TERF, Fraser had to sort of smuggle them up the back stairs so people wouldn't know that I was meeting them. And I met Karen Inglis-Smith and Kiri Tunks, and I'm really grateful to them because they gave me such a good briefing. They made me realise that I could not leave this issue alone, and that I would have to say something about it. And when I eventually decided, well, the first public intervention I made was when a number of us, including Joan, who really was in the forefront of fighting against gender identity ideology in the SNP, a number of us SNP, MSPs, MPs and councillors, we wrote an open letter to the Scotsman asking for gender recognition reform not to be rushed through and for there to be a more thoughtful approach. And really, it was a very, very measured letter, and it was written against the background that no SNP conference had ever voted for self-ID. It simply voted for reform of the Gender Recognition Act. And the backlash and the outcry against that letter was quite extraordinary. And then I decided, I was looking for an opportunity for me to make a public intervention in an effective sort of way. And at Westminster, at that time, I was a member of the Joint Committee on Human Rights, which I now chair, which is a committee of both houses, which looks at human rights issues within the United Kingdom. And we were doing an inquiry into democracy and freedom of expression in politics. And we had Twitter and Facebook executives in. And I decided to cross-examine the Twitter executive at length about the way in which Twitter was taking down, cancelling the accounts and taking down the posts of women who said things like, woman, adult, human, female, lesbians don't have penises, but was leaving up very abusive attacks on women and threats of violence for being TERFs. And before I decided to do this, my Fraser, who advises me, said, this is going to destroy your political career. If you do this, you will never be the leader of the SNP, which I had ambitions to be at that time, and it's going to destroy you. And I actually thought he was exaggerating, and we very carefully drew up a statement I would make in advance about how I supported trans rights and I supported equal rights. So I did all that, and I did my little bit, and because I've been very well prepared and prepped by various women in the gender critical movement, I think it went quite well, and the clip of me cross-examining this Twitter executive went viral. And the backlash, Fraser was right, the backlash was absolutely phenomenal, including a death threat, and I had to have a police escort to my constituency surgery that Friday, which was in Collinton Library. For anyone who knows Edinburgh, that's one of the poshest bits of my constituency. And it did have a very funny moment when Fraser was in the office trying to explain to this young policeman what was going on, and he was in the meeting room was open, and we just heard this young policeman say, "A woman with a penis," in a really surprised voice. So obviously that policeman had not at that stage received his diversity training. I'm sure he's having it now. But anyway, my point is that this really quite, I thought, measured intervention designed to show that Twitter didn't have a hateful conduct policy that complied with the Equality Act because it didn't protect women because sex wasn't a protected characteristic, how important this was, met with the most enormous backlash because, of course, any woman in politics who sticks her head above the parapet in this issue, she must be destroyed, as Joan knows, to her cost, because once articulate women start to explain what's going on and people start to take notice, the general public realise the craziness of the whole ideology. Now, I could talk about what happened to me thereafter. I won't, because it just sounds like a big, long, poor me. But I actually feel quite positive at the moment, because I have survived umpteen attempts to smear me from, I'm sad to say, very sad to say, mainly from within my own party. There's been a few from other sources, particularly the Scottish Greens, but mainly from within my own party. And thanks to people like Maya Forstater and Alison Bailey, who took these pioneering cases, I think the SNP leadership in HQ realised that what I was telling them, that if they expelled me, I would take them down for discrimination against me on the grounds of my sexuality and belief. They realised that I was right. So I think those of us who are gender critical and want to be involved in politics now, there's a lot more weapons at our disposal. And even in the last 48 hours, Philia, who were supposed to have a stall at the Plaid Cymru conference in Wales, had their stall cancelled at the last minute. And Lisa Marie has said, I can tell you this, and I think she's tweeted it, that they're taking legal advice. Now, I've always thought that, as a lawyer, I've always thought political parties are bound under the Equality Act to not discriminate in the provision of goods and services. And of course, if you're letting somebody, if you're selling stall space to someone at a conference, in the same way you couldn't say to someone, you can't have a stall because you're black or because you're gay, you can't say to them, you can't have a stall because some of your beliefs are gender critical. So I hope that Philia will use the law to score a win here successfully, because if they do, it could be a big win for all of us who are politically active, because, well, we've not had any kind of gender critical presence at the SNP conference for years. It's on my to-do list, and if there's a clear legal indication that that can happen, then that's one way forward. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is, politics is a very long game. And people often ask me why I have stayed in the Scottish National Party, despite the way I've been treated, and despite some of the ludicrous, loony legislation that my colleagues have passed at Holyrood, some of which we'll no doubt talk about as the afternoon goes on. It's because I think if you want to change things, political parties are quite useful vehicles. And if you want to change parties, you have to actually be a member of them, and you have to fight from inside to try and change them. And if you take the example of the Labour Party, whatever you think about Corbynites versus Blairites, the Blairites, or the Starmerites, whatever they call themselves now, sat out 10 years of Corbyn, and now they're in the ascendancy and they look like they're going to win an election. In the SNP, the Sturgeon era is over. Poor Hamza hasn't, poor Hamza has inherited a very difficult situation to deal with. But I think the tide is turning in terms of the agenda of gender identity ideology, and I stay in the SNP. It's not been easy to do so, because I think it's important for there to be gender critical voices in our mainstream parties. But I do have to say that if any woman came to me now and asked me for my advice about entering politics, I think I would have to be honest and say that had I known what I was going to be up against this time 10 years ago, I would never have left my job at the bar and gone into elected politics. But I'm glad I didn't know, because I think the person I was then, if she could have seen what was ahead of me, she would have gone, oh, no thanks. But now I'm actually really glad that I've been able to be a part of it, particularly because I see so many wins for feminism, and not just for the gender critical movement. I think gender critical feminism, as I said at the beginning, has reinvigorated feminism and women working together, and can bring us new wins in other areas, and also help give voice to many of the women who get overlooked. I might be a bit biased because I just celebrated my 58th birthday last week, but I do think middle-aged and older women are quite often overlooked. But one of the things that I've been involved in, two of the things I've been involved in the British Parliament, which I think are going to be useful in making the voices of older women heard, is firstly the WASPI campaign. And I bet there are women in this room who've been part of that. I have to say that is one of the most amazing political campaigns I've observed since I've been in politics, and it's brought some success. Labour Party are running for the hills now from the promises they made, but it's going to be the job of Parliament to, well, the Tories won't deliver, but to try and hold the next government to account on this. And then another thing that I've been involved in that was mentioned earlier is the campaign for an apology to women who suffered forced adoption, and indeed their children. Now, working with Harriet Harman at Westminster and the Joint Committee on Human Rights, we did a big inquiry into this a couple of years ago. We published a very detailed report recommending that there should be an official apology. And there has been a governmental apology in Edinburgh and in Cardiff, but not yet by the British government. And that's a really big thing to push for. And when I was speaking in the WASPI debate at Westminster a couple of weeks ago, one of the things I said was, parliamentarians, celebrate International Women's Day. Not in the same way they celebrate other days, it's quite low key, but they do celebrate it. Everyone makes a fuss of their mum, or has a fuss made of them if they're a mum, on Mother's Day. But there's no point in paying lip service to things like International Women's Day and Mother's Day, unless if, as a politician, when women have huge concerns, such as the WASPI women or the women who deserve an apology for forced adoption, if politicians don't speak up for them. And politicians sometimes forget that middle-aged and older women have votes as well. And I think someone who got a big reminder of that recently was Leo Varadkar in Ireland. That's one hell of a victory for grassroots women's campaigning. When he thought he was going to get big brownie points for his woke virtue signalling, throwing women's rights under the bus, and he got the fright of his life, and now he's gone off with his tail between his legs. Rather a familiar tale, it has to be said. So I suppose the reason I'm mentioning that is that we need to remember that we have power if we organise together. And in order to organise, some of us have to be members of political parties, but we also really need to work cross-party. And that's a message I'd like to leave you with. Thanks.
Thank you, Joanna. I'm now going to hand over to Joanne.
Thank you very much, and as other people have said, it's a great privilege to be here, and we know that the young men looking on might be thinking, my goodness, another old woman with white hair that I can disagree with. Believe me, brothers, you wouldn't have agreed with me when my hair was brown. Saying the things now that I believed then, that we believe, are threatening and dangerous to these young men in the same way they were threatening and dangerous to old-fashioned, male, sexist 40 years ago. There is nothing new under the sun. They may think they're progressive. We need, and we have done a job, and the women in this place have been part of unpicking the notion of what now dresses or calls itself progressive. And it's already been mentioned, there's a few Joes on the platform. I was the only Joe that voted no in the referendum. If anybody had told me we would have ended up here, I probably wouldn't have believed it. But the fact is, the least surprising thing that I've had to come to terms with in my political life is even more astonishing. That we could be in a position that we would talk about hate crime and exclude women. That we could be in a position of thinking that we can justify men in women's prisons, in women's changing rooms, that we could be asking young girls who are going on a school trip, this is Glasgow City Council's policy, asking young girls going on that trip, if a boy identifies as a girl, they get the group, the theory is, they'll get the group to have a vote. Do they understand how bullying and peer pressure operate? And I don't think they have. So it's the least astonishing thing to me that I'm on this wonderful platform, but that says a lot about where we are politically. And I also want to say one final thing about, I watched what happened in Dundee last weekend, and we're becoming almost desensitized to the scale of aggression that women face when they come together to campaign and speak up. And I think we should be angry about people who would rationalise shouting in the faces of women, talking about their experience. I dealt with a lot of old dinosaur men in my lifetime in the Labour Party. I think we've got a factory that made them back in the day. Not one of them would have stood in Dundee Square and shout and spit at women who were talking about their direct experience of violence. That is how desensitised we have come. The scale of security that's required when women come together. We had an event in Edinburgh when I was still an elected member, and I've never forgotten it. I lived through times when there was demonstrations about the Irish problem at every Labour meeting in a run-up to an election, and when we had to introduce security at party conferences. I have never seen the scale of security that was required for women to come together and talk about their lived experience as women and demanding their rights to speak up for women. We can't allow that to be normalised, because the most vulnerable women in prisons or children in care or young women who have experienced sexual violence are the ones at the sharp end of this. And that's why it's been a great privilege for me to be part of Byra's Place. Because what Byra's Place, because of the wonderful Jo Rowling, who chose to use what she can to give a space for women, that what Byra's Place does, it provides a space for women to come to, because ideology has driven women out of the spaces where that support was already there for them. And that to me is unforgivable, that the people who pay most for people to have a theoretical argument about sex work are the most vulnerable in our communities and our society. The very thing that drove women's participation in the first place. And, I wanted just to say something very briefly about why women's participation matters. And it matters whether people are in political parties or not. I was tribal as they come. I joined the Labour Party as a young woman. And it didn't take me long to work out that actually you still have to understand that you're not, even although you're the party of equality, there's not necessarily equality to be practiced inside your party. And that's why women came together and organised. They talked about things about women's lives. So it wasn't just about economic, industrial policy. It was about job segregation. It was about birth control. It was about education, about all the things. It was about pornography. It was about prostitution. It was about male violence against women. And understanding that women shaped policy that said, this is actually, it's more than just about your wages. And what kept me, it wasn't just about being internal to the party. It's why women who are not necessarily in a political party matter. Because they always operated as a conscience and a charge and a challenge to what I was doing inside the Labour Party. I always see feminists as giving me handrails in my own politics that made sure that when you went into a political party, feminists were still speaking out and challenging and pressurising women. And I think that is also a really important thing to do. So we know that how important it was in terms of women's lives. And we also know that now theoretically, women matter. I'm astonished at the extent to which people will talk about period poverty, women facing violence, and they never join the dots, that they can live in their own heads saying those things, being put in positions as women to represent women, while at the same time also arguing for an ideology that diminishes women's safety, women's security, women's rights, and women's capacity to achieve their own potential. We have to be alive to internally in our parties, but we also have to be alive externally. The extent to which political parties advocate for women, or they simply appropriate women's policies in order to win votes. And the irony of all ironies, in my view, is that when you're told internally, as Joanne has been done and Joan too, and have paid a heavy price for it, that you need to behave yourself in the interests of the party because we want to be unified to the voters, it turns out the voters agree with us. When we had the pantomime of the gender recognition bill going through just ahead of Christmas, what was most astonishing, apart from the fact it was profoundly wrong and dangerous, was that its greatest advocates, the people who believed it more strongly than anybody else, how much they cared, how inclusive they were, how much they looked up to the balcony to get applause, confronted with the reality of a man in leggings, could not explain their own policy. The rest of the world knew that post-charge transitioning Isla Bryson in leggings, they knew it was a man, and they knew it was unacceptable. And it turned out that the people who were the greatest advocates couldn't explain, and it's been partly responsible for some important politicians leaving the stage. So I think there is an issue in political participation in challenging our politicians. Can I also say one, I'm conscious I'm going too long. It is not, being a woman is not a shield against argument and debate. I've been arguing with people all of my political life. I mean, actually, I argue less with the opposition now with my own party. We should celebrate argument. We should celebrate debate. We should celebrate the fact that we don't agree and we want to persuade. But it's unacceptable to me that women who have got elected, who understand, who've said that women's representation matters, when somebody gives them a hard time, says, you're only saying that to me because I'm a woman. Now, there is sexism, and we challenge that. If a woman is given a hard time because of the way she dresses, because of the way she looks, the way she speaks, or because she's got children and has care and responsibilities, these should not matter a whit. But it should not be a defence against somebody asking you to justify your position. We've had too much in the recent past from folk who are prepared to sell out women, but at the same time use the shield of women to rebut and resist any debate or argument. And I think that has been unacceptable. And so I think in terms of what we learned, in terms of political representation, my dear friend Maria Fife, what we sent down, it's hard to believe now, we sent down 50 MPs from the Labour Party in 1987, and Maria Fife was the only woman amongst them. She was a wonderful woman, an amazing woman who was able to speak out for women, but she couldn't speak out for all women all the time, and we understood that's why we need the diversity and range of women that greater representation for women brings. And that is, but it is a responsibility then to bring that to the table. And one final point I'll make is this. The Labour Party embraced women's rights. We embraced 50-50 for the Scottish Parliament, and I think shaped the political debate around what other parties were expected to do. And we then moved on to having quotas. But there will never be a substitute for women coming together. We lost internally in our party the ability to organise and meet together as women, and we're restoring it now, because that gave us the courage and the confidence and the strength to go and speak and argue for women. It's no use having 50% of the women in the room if they still only listen to the 50% that are male, and the women voices aren't heard. So my last point is this: in terms of political representation, you don't need to be in a political party. You can be very powerful externally to it. But whatever you do, and this room tells us more than anything, women coming together and giving each other support, solidarity, sisterhood. At the very end of my working life. It's been the privilege of my life to have my politics reignited by an understanding of the power of movements, that not just about addressing and being tidy and neat. All the joy and parts and fragments of this movement of women coming together is the most wonderful thing. And I want to thank any woman who ever sent me a wee message or a tweet or just simply gave me the support when what I was trying to do. If we do that for women, then women's voices, as they have in the past, will definitely be listened to, because when they try to exclude us, women just organise all the more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joanne. Could I just remind everybody that please, there's some post-it notes on your tables. If you've got questions, can you give them to the stewards in orange, please? Thank you. Our next speaker is Joan McAlpine.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and thank you for inviting me here today. I'm no longer active in politics, but I like to come to events like this now and again to re-energise myself in the way that Joanne's just described. I want to start by addressing directly the topic we're discussing, which is women's representation. And Joanne talked about that latterly when she talked about the work that she had done within the Labour Party to make sure that our Parliament properly represented women, and that was in the run-up to the Parliament being formed in 1999. That was one of the things that we most looked forward to. It was going to be a different kind of Parliament where different kinds of people were going to be represented. So we've got to a stage where, you know, the Labour Party led, I think it's fair to say, on women's representation, and the SNP followed suit eventually. And so we've now got a situation where the majority parties, the parties of government in the Scottish Parliament, have a majority of women. And the Parliament itself has 45% women, which is probably one of the best gender balances in Europe. However, despite that, that Parliament passed the GRR bill. So I think clearly we need women's representation, and we need to put mechanisms in place to make sure that women are represented. But if it's the party machine that decides which women are going to be represented, and if it's the professional classes, professional political classes that are represented, then you don't really get change. It's very different from the grassroots female movement that Joanne's just talked about. The previous Parliament wasn't quite as balanced in terms of female representation, but it was still much better than Westminster. And despite that, we passed a hate crime bill that excluded women as a protected characteristic. It expanded the definition of transgender identity to include cross-dressing males. Yeah. People who did not identify as transgender, but were cross-dressing males, they have protection in this hate crime bill, but women do not, which I thought was one of the most scandalous aspects of it, and it's why I was very proud to support Johann's amendment that attempted to include women in the hate crime legislation. It was very, very disappointing to me that every woman in the SNP group supported the hate crime bill. I abstained on it because I think, along with everybody else, it's quite difficult to vote for hate crime, if you know what I mean, which is how it would have been perceived. So I think you've got to be careful about these things. But I salute Joanne and I think it was Elaine Smith and Jenny Mara who did vote against it. And I think I was listening to the debates on the way up today, and the reassurances that we were given around free speech, particularly for women, by the Cabinet Secretary for Justice, Hamza Yusuf, who's now the First Minister. And he basically said in the free speech parts of the bill, which dealt with the stirring up hatred offence, that offensive speech would not be criminal. Well, we know over the last couple of weeks, when we've seen the training that Police Scotland have been given their officers, that it's very clear that offensive speech, or speech that's perceived by some people to be offensive, could very well be captured in this legislation. And it shames Scotland, actually. It makes me ashamed. And it makes me ashamed because we had so much optimism when we formed the Parliament, which I still very much support, obviously. But it makes me ashamed that, given the optimism that we were going to create a better country, that we are now, you know, a bit of a laughingstock, actually, in terms of the attack on free speech and particularly women's rights that bill represents. So I want to say a little bit about myself and my political journey. I'm not a natural politician. I've always been engaged with politics. I was a journalist for many years before I entered Parliament. And like most journalists, I guess that, you know, I tend to be quite individualistic often. I've never been accused of groupthink. I don't think if I believe in something, I say it. I was a columnist for many, many years. I was politicised by a number of things, particularly Thatcher years, campaigning for the Scottish Parliament, and the anti-poll tax movement was a huge influence on my political thinking. One of the things about the anti-poll tax movement that was very, very interesting is that it was led in a grassroots sense by women, because the anti-poll tax unions in schemes across Scotland, particularly street by street, were organised by women, making banners out of bed sheets and phoning one another and stopping sheriff officers coming to pin people's possessions. So that was really, really influential on me. And then I've always supported Scottish independence, so when the SNP government was elected in 2007, that I found that inspiring. I felt that they had aspirations for our country and aspirations to make our Parliament more powerful. And so I began to get more political in my journalism and began blogging. And so I kind of entered politics through a kind of like unusual route. I didn't come up through the grassroots, I guess. I was already quite a well-known journalist. I didn't get in that way, but I think probably it was my blog, actually. It was called Go Lassie Go, that resulted in me becoming more politically engaged and being invited to attempt to stand for a seat, which eventually got in on the list. So that's how I got there. And Joanne described herself as tribal. I guess when it came to independence, I was pretty tribal. I believed it passionately. But there were a number of issues that I did speak out on. You have to pick your battles, you know, like land reform, for example. I campaigned on land reform, didn't feel it had gone far enough in the Parliament, and there were some individual issues maybe that would affect a constituency issue, which I stood up on. So I had been known to stand up against the party that I was a member of. But generally speaking, I did adhere to party discipline. However, that changed with this particular issue in terms of the gender recognition issue. How did I get there? I guess I began reading online work by Fair Play for Women and Women's Place UK. There was very little in the mainstream media, but I became more aware of that. But there wasn't very much that you could do about it. The movement in Scotland was very, very small. But the thing that most struck me, and I think the thing that I found most offensive, more so than the fact that people wanted self-ID of gender, the thing that I found most offensive was the lack of debate and the portraying of women who clearly had exemplary track record on the left, in progressive politics, in feminist politics, those kind of women being portrayed as hateful and not being allowed to articulate their position. That's what I found just the most offensive thing. But what could I do about it? So when I was re-elected in 2016, I found myself chair of the Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Relations Committee. There wasn't really much opportunity, I didn't think, in that committee work to address that particular concern until, because we were the Culture Committee, a bill called the Census Amendment Act came before us in 2018. That particular bill was to make questions on sexual orientation and gender identity voluntary. So it was a very minor, apparently, piece of legislation. Because just to give you a bit of background, when the census was first introduced, all the questions were compulsory. And if you didn't answer them, you could be subject to a criminal conviction. And as they added more personal questions, they had to pass legislation to make sure that these more personal questions, say on religion, for example, were voluntary questions, so that people couldn't be sent to jail for refusing to divulge their religion. And the same would have applied to these questions on sexual orientation and gender identity. So the committee had no problem with that particularly, including these questions. But when we read the bill, or when I read the bill, it was clear that there was a clause in the bill after the definition of sex which said including gender identity. So it was very clear that lobbying groups and groups within the government wanted to use the census bill in order to try to change the definition of sex in the census, and then they could turn round, this was before the GRR, they could then turn round and say, well, you see, self-identification's in the census. The census is gold standard, so, what's the fuss about? So it was very clear that this was an opportunity, not just to address that particular problem in the legislation, but also to tackle head-on this issue of no debate. If we could get gender-critical feminists into our parliament speaking on the record, then there wouldn't be no debate anymore. They wouldn't be able to be blockaded from student unions and church halls or whatever. But when we went to the Parliament's research service, which is very good, it's called SPICE, it briefs MSPs for debates and to help them with their committee work. It's kind of a bit like the House of Commons Library. And it normally provides an excellent service. So when I asked the researchers there to provide us with the other side of the debate, they said, but there isn't a debate. There's nobody who opposes this. So, as committee convener, you have quite a lot of power. I mean, you cannot dictate to the committee. You must get your colleagues across all parties that are members of the committee to agree. But you do have quite a lot of power to influence the way parliamentary business goes. So what I did is I approached she was the person that I thought was most outspoken online about the issue, and that was Kathleen Stock, who was then very active on Twitter. And I said, listen, there's this very obscure piece of legislation about the census in the Scottish Parliament that you'll never have heard of, but if you could get it out there that we would like evidence about what this piece of legislation would do, that would be really helpful. So she did that, and also spoke to Murray Blackburn Mackenzie, who had written a little bit in the Herald, and so we managed to get out there that a call for evidence, because if you want people to speak on the record in Parliament, you can't say, let's get Kathleen Stock in if she's not submitted any written evidence. They would just say, well, there's no debate. There's, who's that person? So because we got out there, we got a lot of written evidence, and because we got that written evidence, we were able to say, hey, there's a debate here. There are some people that don't like this legislation. Let's hear them. And so as a result, we were able to invite people to give evidence on the record in the Scottish Parliament. The people we invited were For Women Scotland, who were then very, very small and under-resourced, and some academics, Rosa Friedman in particular, because she was a human rights professional, a human rights professor who had also raised issues about the effect on women. So, in one fell swoop, no debate was over, and after that we had a series of meetings in the Parliament. Some were organised by Joanne and her colleagues, some were organised by myself, just to get this talked about. And there was a lot of abuse, a lot of online abuse, and there was abuse of myself within my own party by people who still have not been held to account. But the era of no debate was over. I'm not saying it was just because of my committee, but I do think that my committee made a big difference. And we were also able to talk about other more direct issues directly relating to the census, like the purpose of the census in gathering information about sex as a protected characteristic and why it was important that we had accurate information. So I'm very proud of that, but I think what it illustrates is that you need to know how politics works, and you need to know how to operate the system. And I remember at the time that the debates were happening in Parliament, saying to For Women Scotland, oh, you do realise we're having a first stage debate, so we'll be getting briefing papers from Stonewall and all these other people, so you need to put a briefing paper in ahead of the debate to all MSPs so that they know what your position is, because they might not read the evidence that the committee's had. I mean, that's the kind of thing that professional lobbyists know, that these well-funded organisations who employ full-time public affairs employees to scrutinise what's coming up in Parliament, make sure the briefings are put in, that MSPs are properly informed. So it's really, really hard work. And we've come a long way since those days, but it is hard work. So we've now got these grassroots organisations that MSPs know that they have to turn to as more of this sort of legislation comes forward. The other thing that came out of that process, I think it's fair to say, is working across parties with Joanne and others. I think if it hadn't been for the lockdown, we would have been able to develop that a lot better. We had just started working together really well, and then the lockdown came, and so we didn't really work together much ahead of the hate crime bill because we weren't in the same room, we couldn't talk. So that was just one of these unfortunate things that happened. But I think in future we can see from grassroots movements like this that there is cross-party working, and the work that Joanna's doing in Westminster shows that there's cross-party working, so there's grounds for optimism there. Also work within your own party, in your own political party. Joanna mentioned the open letter that we wrote to the Scotsman, and Ash signed that despite being a junior minister. It was a very, very brave thing to do. And it was the first step towards organising within our party, the SNP. We later formed the Women's Pledge within the SNP, which we formed at the party conference in 2019. And it was very clear that, if you want to get anywhere, it's very easy to capture political parties. If you're part of a small, well-organised group, you can capture policy within a party. So if you can form your own lobby groups and play them at their own game, hopefully try to be a bit more democratic than they are, then you can wield influence. And in the SNP in 2020, I think it was, there was elections to the NEC, or was it 2019, Joanna? I can't remember. It was 2020 that through, and again, that was in the middle of the lockdown. I think if it hadn't been for the lockdown, which apart from the fact that we weren't in the same room together, people were worried about all sorts of things, like their relatives dying and being sick and all the rest of it. So it was really hard, but despite that, we almost got control of the NEC. Not quite, though. But it was which some of us has paid the price for. But it shows that even in those circumstances, we were able to organise and change things. And probably, like the repercussions of of the victories of that particular group within the NEC are still being felt, particularly by the former party leader, because it wasn't just about gender that she was being challenged on in some of those NEC meetings, and that is still an ongoing police matter, which we will not discuss here. And that's just a little brief through of my political journey, and it's not just about joining a political party as a woman and speaking up. You've got to organise, and it can be very, very hard work. I mean, I saw myself when we had the first gender recognition bill, which was dropped, you know, burning the midnight oil, making sure that we had a submission from the SNP's Women's Pledge Group to put in that was comprehensive and made the case. It is a lot of hard work, but you can see from gatherings like this that that hard work has paid off, so well done to everyone.
Thank you, Joan. I've been passed a message to say that we've got lots of questions, and we're going to extend the session till about 4:15, if that's okay with everybody. And I've also been asked to remind you that we have a couple of areas upstairs where there's a selection of stalls that are selling merchandise and books and dragons, but sadly no dinosaurs. There's also an exhibition of photographs of women's creative campaigning over the years, and I'm sure some of you here, if you pop up and have a look, will recognise some of your hateful haberdashery. So I'm going to move on, and we're going to hear from Ash Regan, MSP. And I just want to say before I move on, I think Ash leaving the SNP has really liberated her. And the amount of times that I love her speeches in the Parliament, and I love to see her hold their feet to the fire. So please give Ash a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I got into politics through the independence referendum. That was the first time I'd ever been active in politics. And a man actually, that I was with when I was sitting on a stall at SNP conference a few years ago, said to me, oh, there's this group that's formed, and they're called Women for Independence, and they're really looking for women speakers to sign up so that they can send women to appear on panels. Some of you will no doubt remember that they were calling out manels, which was, you know, male-only panels, wanting women's voices, women's viewpoints to be represented during the independence referendum. It's obviously a very big political happening. They want women to be represented. But they found that they couldn't, you know, they would call the organisers, and the organisers would say, well, we've asked lots of women to come and speak, and none of them will come. So they then realised they had to put together their own list. And at the time that I signed on for that list, I had never spoken in public before. So I got, immediately the phone started ringing and got dispatched off to my first event, which was in Galashiels, and gave my first speech. Thought I was going to throw up just before I started speaking, but I didn't, so that was good, and it got better from there. But after having gone through that experience, I really enjoyed it, and I thought, I should think about getting into elected politics. So I was already a member of the SNP from before that, so I got selected eventually and put myself forward, because at that point, I felt very strongly that we needed to have more women in politics, and that there weren't enough women in the Scottish Parliament. We needed to get it up closer to 50% of the women. And we've all heard that phrase, you know, that we've got to have women sitting at the table, because just being in the room changes the conversation. So that was one of the most shocking, I think, and disturbing things for me, was watching the gender recognition situation play out, particularly in my political party, which at the time was the SNP, but it was also, I was watching it in other political parties as well, particularly the Labour Party, that some of the people that were pushing this so hard, so people like Nicola Sturgeon, Shona Robeson, Shirley Ann Somerville, Maggie Chapman, Lorna Slater, the women that were at the front of this, the women that were pushing it forward, and also all the women my female colleagues who lined up to vote for it. And after doing so, then made it quite clear that they were happy to stand by or even take part in the sort of bullying of colleagues that's been discussed already. And then I suppose what I would describe it from my sense of this, isolation. So they made it very clear to me that they would probably be quite glad if I just fell through a trapdoor and was never heard from again. It hasn't quite worked out the way they were hoping. So political parties are, I mean, Joanna has obviously explained we need them, and I guess to an extent we do, that's the system we're in, but just to explain what it's like when you're in a political party like that, and this, obviously my most experience is in the SNP, you are expected to, you sign something. So when you actually go in to become a candidate, you actually sign a piece of paper to say that you will always vote with the party. So you've already signed up to that. And I remember reading that when I was signing up to go into the SNP, and my sort of pen hesitated over signing up to that, because I was thinking to myself, oh, am I going to be able to, agree to everything? But I did for quite a long time. So everyone here is talking about the letter that three of us on here signed up to. That wasn't the first thing that we decided to do in the SNP about the gender reform. That was the result of months, if not even a year, of talking about this inside the SNP, certainly in Holyrood, having little meetings. For my part, I'd gone to see the minister in charge of the bill. I had spoken to the chief whip. I had spoken to the parliamentary business manager. I'd spoken to other colleagues. I'd had sort of whispered conversations with journalists. You had to sort of find out first if they were pro or anti, and then you could have a conversation with them. And after the signing letter was really a cry for help in a way. It was to sort of say that we tried everything we could inside the party, and we'd come to our last resort, which was to actually put something out into the public domain, put our names to it. And I was one of a few junior ministers actually that signed up to that, probably naively, not realizing that it was going to end up on the front page of the newspapers the next day. But it did. So I got 3 bollockings for that. So I got one from Humza, one from Nicola Sturgeon, and I think it was Mike Russell was the other one. And the one with Humza, I knew I wouldn't have to say very much in that one, because he likes to talk. And so Julie, 25 minutes into this conversation, he finally stops talking, sort of looks at me and says, "But Ash, why did you do it?" And I said, "Humza, I did it for the women and girls of Scotland." And he was like, "Pfft." But he said, "Well, they won't thank you." And I don't think he's been past my office recently, but if he were to stumble into the members' block, he would see floor to ceiling, Joan had this as well when she was there a few years ago, floor to ceiling thank you cards written and sent to me and to other politicians as well, so it's not just to me, to thank us for taking a stand in the way that we did. So I want to thank the women that have supported me and others as we've taken what has been quite a difficult journey in basically standing up to our political parties. If you do stand up to your political party, as Joan has said, you will find yourself in a situation where you're put on a disciplinary list, you can find yourself shunned, and they make it very clear that they will just look for ways to get rid of you, and in some cases they actually succeed in getting rid of you. So that's why I think there were women who did believe in the ideology, but I equally think there were many women and male colleagues that I had that did not believe in this ideology, but for the sake of their own careers, and also for the sake of loyalty to the party, which is another thing, they decided that they would vote with the government on that. I decided that I couldn't vote with the government on that. After speaking up at Cabinet and other places about this ideology, I decided that I wouldn't, and I knew this day would be coming for quite a long time. For about a year out, I'd spoken to other colleagues and said that it was likely it was going to come to that, and you go through the process. And I'd had a couple of meetings with special advisors who were there on behalf of the First Minister, and they're taking notes. And you think, okay, well, I'm getting the arguments across. Maybe somebody will go away and they'll actually look at this and they'll think it through and they'll realize that this is an electoral disaster. No. So on the day of the vote, I'm posing for photos in front of a fire engine because I'm at a high school in my constituency and launching some stuff to do with fireworks, which was what I was responsible for and partly in my ministerial portfolio. And I'd had conversations with the special advisors in the run-up to this, and I told them that I would resign if, that I would not be voting for it. And I went back to the car, and I got my handbag out, and I got my phone out, and I had a message from the senior special advisor, and it said, turn up and vote with the government. And that's all it said. And I looked at that message, and I sort of sat there for quite a bit, and I thought, well, this is it then, because I will not be turning up, and I will not be voting with the government. So I went home, and obviously it was quite a difficult weekend. I didn't really look on Twitter very much because I was afraid of what I would read on there. And obviously the media were phoning and so on. And I decided that if I didn't want to be chased around the Parliament by the media, it was better to give them a statement. So we organised it at exactly the same time as the SNP group meeting, because we knew they'd be busy. And one of my colleagues, who is still talking to me, and it's a diminishing number now, said to me, she said, it was like the thick of it. Special advisors were bursting into the room. She said, I knew something was happening. So I was giving my very short statement to the media, at which I was, I was nervous doing that, standing up, putting my head above the parapet on this issue, like, other people have said. And I immediately then started to have meetings, because I then wanted to take part, because that was stage one, and obviously there was a couple more stages to go in the bill. And obviously, Marion was from Forum Scotland, was the first to arrive. She rang me, she said, I'm in the Parliament, I'm in reception, come down and see me. I've got something for you. And she gave me a suffragette scarf, which I then wore into the chamber. And I received, immense support from Murray Blackburn Mackenzie in preparing for taking part in the debates and submitting amendments. We did some excellent cross-party working. I did try to work with Labour. I had quite a few conversations with Labour colleagues about what we were doing, but it ended up being more between the SNP Rebels and the Conservative group, because they were the ones that were putting in the most amendments. And I was the only person to pass, or to get passed, to get enough support to pass an amendment that was not government supported in that entire debate, where there was hundreds and hundreds of amendments, and it was about freedom of expression. We're not sure that it would have done any good, but we thought it was good to have it in there and to get it voted through. And Forum Scotland also supported me, but what I would say, and what shocked me, and I kind of got to the point where I'd worked this out, but that there was nowhere else to go to for information, because every single organisation that you would think you could go to for information, so like the Human Rights Commission, for example, or Engender, a feminist policy group, I know, that they were all so captured, that you would have conversations with people and they would just be repeating the government lines back to you. And I'd be thinking, well, I'm looking for information. I need to understand this so that I can present a coherent argument in the Parliament. And that was very shocking, that there was nowhere to go, looking across the landscape in Scotland, to get that information other than those groups that I've mentioned that had to form to fight the legislation. That's a shocking state of affairs. It really is. So the Parliament moved on. We got to the point where they passed the bill, and some of my colleagues got up to applaud activists in the gallery. I obviously stayed sitting down. And the women's rights campaigners, I'm sure maybe people in this room were in the gallery and been sitting there for days on end, right into the night, watching us all get amendment after amendment after amendment voted down by the government. And they started kicking off, and then there was the memorable Merkin moment. And then the women were shouting, and Nicola Sturgeon had turned her chair so that she had her back almost to the women in the gallery. And my mum had noticed that. She was watching all, and she said, Nicola can't look at them. She's kind of sat with her back to them. And this carried on. And I think I could feel these waves of frustration coming from the women's rights campaigners while some of my colleagues were applauding the trans rights activists that were in the gallery. And then the women started crying, and they were shouting, and they were desperate, and they were frustrated, and they were sad. I started crying, which I've never done in the Parliament. I hope to never ever do again, to sit in our Parliament and cry because I was ashamed of what that Parliament had done that day. And I think what Nicola Sturgeon and perhaps some of the others didn't understand, and somebody said that to me, they said they were watching when I and others were speaking in the debate, Nicola's face. And they were saying, you know, it's like it's the first time she's heard these arguments. And I think it actually was the first time that she'd heard these arguments. And so they didn't understand. They thought the women in the gallery were nutcases. They thought they were the fringe, you know, some sort of lunatic fringe. They didn't realize that the women in the gallery were teachers, and they were social workers, and they were union, you know, trade union activists and managers and that sort of thing. They were, you know, people that were just at the end of their tether with what had gone on. So it was a very difficult time, and I really think that in doing that, unfortunately, certainly the government has lost the trust of the public, but I think the Parliament as an institution has lost the trust of the public, and that is a real shame. So I soldiered on for a bit in the SNP for as long as I could, and then it just became untenable. I wanted to be able to speak up, and my two things that I'm the most interested in and what drive me as a politician are Scottish independence and the rights of women and girls. And I felt that I couldn't sit on the backbenches for 2 years with it zipped and not say anything and not contribute and not try to make an impact. So I made the decision to move parties, and I know that for some people that, you know, that's not a good thing, but I had to do what I felt was right. And, you know, then we had the position where I had to move offices because obviously the SNP then want to chuck you out. They don't want you near them. You're contagious or something, I think. And then the Greens were telling the media that they didn't want me to have an office next to them because I was too dangerous. Well, I think I am dangerous, but not maybe in the way that they meant. So I'm moving on to do other things and do the things that I'm passionate about. And so I'm going to be launching a members' bill shortly because I want to change the laws around prostitution. So I'm going to need your help. I am going to need you to get in touch with all your politicians and tell them about this bill, ask them to support it, and ask to meet them. So if it's your politicians, they should meet with you. Ask to meet them, and then we'll provide, we've got a website, we'll provide you with arguments if you need them. Many of you I know will be well versed in this anyway. And you can go and talk to your elected representatives, because at this point I don't know if I have the numbers. And if it falls on the gender recognition lines, I may not have the numbers. So, but we'll see, and we'll do it anyway. But yeah, that's one of the things that I've treasured, is the support that I've had from other women, the new friends that I've made through going through what has been quite a difficult year or so, and the cross-party working. And I think if we keep it up, I think we are winning, and we're going to find out quite soon the power that women have when they organise and work together in the way that we have. It's been really inspiring, so thank you all.
Thank you, Ash. It's actually really interesting to get an insight into what female parliamentarians have had to tolerate. And I thank each of you for sharing some of your stories. We're now moving on to the question session. And we've received a really, really important question that I'm going to start with. And the question is Joanna Cherry still single? That is the question.
It depends who's asking.
Brilliant. So the next question is, and I think this is a really interesting question, how can we fund an information campaign in Scotland to reach women and girls about their rights to safe places? Anybody want to take this on?
Okay, right. Well, the difficulty is at the moment that the law is not clear. Arguably, under the Equality Act, the word sex should refer to biological sex, and the word woman should mean a biological woman. And if that was clearly the law, then of course the position would be that women do have the right to single-sex spaces, not just for safety, but also for reasons of dignity and privacy. But of course the law is not clear at the moment, and I'm looking up because I can see the For Women Scotland powerhouses up in the gallery. They are, I can see Susan and Marion, They are taking this case to the Supreme Court to clarify that the law is, as I've described it, that sex means biological sex. And there's also a movement to persuade the British government, because the Equality Act is a reserved matter, to amend the law. And the current Prime Minister, Conservative Prime Minister, much as it pains me to say it, because on other issues I can't abide where they stand, but he's good on this issue, although he hasn't actually brought forward any legislation. There was a private member's bill in Parliament that people got terribly excited about a couple of weeks ago. I'm going to be honest with you, I was asked by Liz Truss to support that private member's bill, and I refused, because it would be political suicide for me to put my name on a bill that's being promoted by Liz Truss. Quite apart from anything else, I find her politics repugnant, but also most of my constituents are livid with her stupid budget that put everyone's rent and mortgages up. So I also think that if Liz Truss cares about women's rights, she should back off them, because she's not the person to take it forward. And I also feel that people get terribly excited about these private members' bills. I've got one at the moment to try and divide out the role of the Lord Advocate and the as legal advisor and head of the prosecution service in Scotland, but it'll probably not go anywhere, because private members' bills very rarely go anywhere unless they have the backing of the government. I actually think the Supreme Court appeal is probably the vehicle that people should be supporting, and I would encourage people to donate to For Women Scots crowdfunder. It's had a big donation from, I don't know, this woman who's got a lot of followers on Twitter and goes around universities saying terrible things about trans people. I think she gave it a bit of money, but it also needs those of us who don't have the same resources maybe to make small donations if they can afford it. You know, every fiver makes a difference. And I think other groups are intervening. I think Sex Matters are intervening. So it seems to me at the moment funding a campaign is a bit premature, because, well, the law is still not clear. So I think the thing to do with your money at the moment is to support this legal action, which I hope will bring clarity in the law. If they don't win, and they've already won quite a big victory, because they've established so far, and I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, that sex does mean biological sex, except somebody with a gender recognition certificate can be counted as a woman, but you can't self-ID as a woman under the Equality Act. So making that clear has been quite important. But I sort of feel that until such times as we have clarity in the law, a campaign is a bit premature, and I think funding at present needs to go into establishing that clarity. That's just my answer off the top of my head to the question. Just giving it a bit of thought just now. I'm very happy to come back on it if people want to pick me up on anything.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to comment? Do you want to comment? No. Right. We've got quite a lot of questions and we're not going to get through them, so we're going to move on. Our next question is, will it be a hate crime to simply exist as a woman?
I don't want to hog the microphone, but as I'm single, I've got plenty of time in my hands. Well, I wrote about this at length in the National in my column yesterday. Was it yesterday? Yeah, Friday. I mean, basically, well, the question was, will it be a crime to be just exist? No, thank. I'm not quite that extreme yet. But you know, I wrote my column, and I wrote a lengthy column because I was so furious last week with all these annoying men who were popping up on the television and the newspapers to tell us to calm down, dears, as Shona Carey even put it, and to try to suggest that there isn't a problem with the legislation. But I also wanted to make it crystal clear that I am not against the idea of having hate crime protections. We've actually had them for quite a long time in the law of Scotland and indeed south of the border as aggravators. So, for example, if somebody beats me up because I'm a lesbian, and it's clear that their motivation was because I'm a lesbian, then it's the crime of assault, but it's aggravated by homophobic or lesbophobic behaviour or whatever. What I'm really worried about is the stirring up offences, which previously only existed for racial hatred and for very good reasons, which I don't have time to go into just now. But these stirring up offences are extremely vague. But just to take a step back, what I really wanted to say in my national article was there's two problems with this legislation from the point of view of women. First of all, we are excluded. We're a protected characteristic under the Equality Act, but we're not deemed worthy of hate. And I wanted to mention what happened in Dundee last weekend and what happened when the woman was assaulted in Aberdeen last year, that we are being spat on and assaulted for simply talking about our rights on the streets of Scotland, but our government and our parliament, because I'm not trying to get the SNP off the hook, but it's not just my party, our parliament doesn't think that we are worthy of special protection that other groups are worthy of. So that's the first problem. But the second problem is it does pose a very difficult problem for those of us who want to continue the gender critical debate, because the offence of stirring up hatred is so widely drawn and talks not just about threatening behaviour but also abusive behaviour, and seems to leave it very much in the eye of the beholder as to whether or not something is hateful. And all the police guidance stresses that, and the police stresses that it's in the eye of the victim whether or not your conduct is hateful, and the police have said they're going to investigate every crime. And although I think a lot of people will not actually, there'll be many women who don't actually end up in court, but they will go through difficult and challenging experiences as a result of being investigated by the police. And for those who do end up in court, such defences as the bill gives them are not wide enough. So if you say something, under the new law, if you say something a bit rude or insulting about someone's religious beliefs, you have a very broadly drawn defence that you can call on. But if you say something rude or insulting about someone's belief in gender identity ideology, you're not afforded the same leeway in your defence. And that's one of the reasons why I think there will be human rights challenges to the bill, that it doesn't properly protect certain cohorts of society's rights to freedom of belief and freedom of expression. So I think there is, and that's just a quick whistle-stop tour, but I think there is a problem with the bill. And it's a bit like what Ash said a minute ago about Nicola Sturgeon looking astonished when these arguments were run for the first time. One of the things that's been most frustrating, and it's not just in the SNP, it's in other parties as well, is the complete failure of people to engage with the detail. These people are legislators. It's their responsibility, it's what they get paid for, to make sure that they're serving all their constituents and there aren't unintended consequences of legislation. And even more seriously, this story that's going around that the Telegraph are covering, that training has involved reference to this character who's very clearly, clearly a parody of J.K. Rowling, and also the fact that the people who are involved in the police training, including some of the police themselves, seem to be LGBTQXYZ activists. We cannot have activist organisations training our police who are supposed to be impartial. And again, I'm not giving out legal advice for free here, not because I'm a cheapskate, but because I'm not actually practicing at the moment, so I'm not insured to give legal advice. But it seems to me that any woman who gets lifted, particularly J.K. Rowling, is going to be able to query the impartiality of our police force. But it's deeply concerning in a democracy that's supposedly bound by the rule of law that we seem to have a police force that is not impartial and that is being directed in its enforcement of the law by a particular lobby group or an activist group. It's just completely and utterly wrong.
I obviously agree with absolutely everything that's just been said. I would say that I think women, and we have to understand it and continue to be angry about it, that women are the victims of hatred. In the last few weeks, I watched a documentary about Sarah Everard, about a young woman called, I think, Faiza Javed, the woman who was thrown from Arthur's Seat, about Emma Caldwell. And that's in 1 week's programmes, and sat and wept at them all. We know that male violence against women is endemic. We don't see somebody from whatever party get invited onto Newsnight to talk about the fact that male violence against women is endemic and we need to do something about it. And so I do think women are the victims and very brave survivors of male violence, and we need to say that. And my worry about the hate crime legislation is it inhibits our ability to do that. We can dance in the head of a pin. I understand the freedom of expression arguments. But for me, the problem with the freedom of expression arguments is that what it is doing is inhibiting campaigning. If it just stopped me saying something outrageous that I want to say that come off the top of my head, does society need to legislate for me being stupid? Probably not. But if the purpose of the hate crime legislation, and it was very hard to vote against it because how could you possibly vote against something that would protect people from hatred? To me, the hate crime legislation sat in the same place as the active decisions to have no debate, the active decision to make it difficult for politicians to gather together to talk about these things, the willful use of language round something like conversion therapy immediately makes it difficult for you to engage with that debate because who's in favour of conversion therapy? It's wee things. I mean, I put through an amendment in the hate crime legislation which was round the fact that they defined heterosexuality as being attracted to another sex. So I asked the minister how many sexes did he think there were, to which, of course, there was no answer. But it's a choice. It's defined in the Equality Act as the opposite sex, so it's a deliberate choice. Many of the changes in language we didn't even notice. When did same-sex marriage get changed to talk about equal marriage? These are strategies and choices that have been made over time. So I think that the thing that we need, I mean, when I was still in the Parliament, some of my more self-regarding male colleagues in some of the parties, shall we say, men who didn't have worry about how big their egos were, explained, well, really, don't worry about it, Joanne, because when it gets to court, it'll be fine. Well, they call me old-fashioned. I don't want a defence that just says you'll be all right if you've got a good lawyer on the day. I'd quite like to know that things that I believe in are not going to end up with me being in court. So I think, so there's 2 points for me. Part of it is about understanding the scale of the challenge to women's lives, to understand the way in which the hate crime legislation is designed to quiet people, silence them. There are very strong women in here and who have been wonderfully courageous women for all of us, who will have particularly to think about what they're saying, and that is an active choice as well. And I think the strongest way in which we can build a campaign to protect women is to build the campaigns to bring back organisations that have been captured, whether it's in the trade union movement, whether it's in our political parties, whether it's in state institutions. A lot of our energy, I think, that's where best now we can protect women and girls by insisting that they understand how important that is, that that's not something that we're going to trade away. But it's no doubt for me that the hate monster, who apart from being a sexist bigot is also hostile to working class people in a shocking, scandalous and patronising way. We have to explain why that's a danger, but it also means our campaign has to be about the capture of institutions.
Can I say something? Is there more to go through? Yeah, just to return to the stirring up hatred aspect of the legislation, the stirring up hatred is defined as something which a reasonable person would consider threatening or abusive. And that seems straightforward, but how do you define a reasonable person if the police are being briefed by organisations like TIE? Or that a government minister like Patrick Harvey can accuse myself and Joanne of being full of hatred, which he did. So is that government minister not a reasonable person? Are the TIE campaign who are briefing the police not a reasonable person? Well, these people would consider, for example, J.K. Rowling saying India Willoughby is a man as abusive. That would be considered as abusive. I attempted, and Joanne also attempted amendments in this area. My amendment added a little bit onto the end of the definition of stirring up hatred, saying it wouldn't be considered threatening or abusive, even if it was perceived by some people to be offensive. And I thought that clarified, and it would stop vexatious complaints from emerging, because it's all very well saying, oh, this will never be going to court, you know, like it won't pass the barrier in court. But who wants, you know, like a teacher or a social worker or J.K. Rowling, for that matter, to be dragged through the court? Well, J.K. Rowling could afford it, obviously, but a lot of people, not just the financial cost, but the cost to their family and everything, of being dragged into court, having to defend themselves, maybe not getting legal aid. Absolutely horrific. So I felt that my amendment would prevent that happening. And I was told by the Cabinet Secretary, Hamza Yusuf, and he said this in Parliament, that it would still allow abusive behaviour to basically people to get away with abusive behaviour. But he had previously said that offensive speech and abusive speech were not the same things. So as with often all this legislation, people just contradict themselves all the time. It's not fit for purpose, in my view, and I think it's really, really dangerous.
Absolutely.
I just want to quickly say something. I agree with Joan that it's not fit for purpose in relation to the stirring up offence. And I think obviously the Scottish Parliament cannot legislate in breach of human rights, and so there will be human rights defences. But I just want to say, I know all sorts of people are planning gestures after the 1st of April, and you know, I said this to a couple of women who came to see me at my constituency surgery yesterday. I said, I'm not telling you to stop exercising your right to freedom of expression. I would never do that. I'm just warning you that the climate is such, and the police have said that they will investigate every complaint, that you need to be prepared for what you're bringing down in your head, and you maybe just need to be careful, I hate to say this, be conscious of what lies ahead. I think we will successfully defeat this in time, and I think there'll be a successful legal challenge in time, but I just want people to be conscious of the fact that, going to the police station to be interviewed is not a pleasant experience. I don't know, it's never happened to me yet, touch wood, and probably is going to happen to me quite soon. Being dragged through, the impact on your home life, the impact on your place of work, just be conscious of that and weigh it in the mix. That's all I'm saying. And I feel so awful, and I'm deeply, deeply ashamed of my political party and of the Parliament of my country that I should have to say this. And I know there'll be some people who just say, damn it to hell, Joanne, I'm going to say what I like. But I'm just warning people to be mindful of what the consequences might be. I'm not saying don't do it, just be mindful of the consequences. I'm sorry to have to say that.
Thank you, Joanne. I think that's important for people to hear that, because it's not fun having the police at your door. However, as Nicola Sturgeon will tell you, thank you. And we'll have these big blue tents. I don't want to be going round to see my friends in these big blue tents in the front garden. However, I am all for sticking a spoke in the works. And while we're waiting for these challenges, these legal challenges to come forth, can I ask you, and share it with friends and family, bombard the police with subject access requests? Because if 400 or 500 of us every month or different ones of us every month send in subject access requests, they will become overwhelmed. So maybe be cautious about what we say publicly, but behind the scenes, just keep sticking spokes into their systems, because there's no way that they can investigate every report of a hate crime. A subject access request is where a body holds information on you. So it's a way of finding out if you have been reported for a hate crime, because we can be reported and never know. And it's important that we know, because especially in the field that I work in, if I go for another job and I need an enhanced PVG, it will come up that I have been reported for a hate crime, and that will be a serious barrier to me getting the job. So I think, while it sticks a spoke in the works, I think it's important that we all know whether we've been reported for a hate crime or not. Anne-Marie.
Look, I'm not telling people what to do. I'm just warning people to be mindful of the consequences, because it would be irresponsible of me not to do so. I'm not against the ideas of having organised protest. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just warning people on an individual basis to be mindful of the consequences for them. I'm not responsible for this law. I'm not a member of the Scottish Parliament. I lost my job on the SNP front bench and I got rape threats because of what I said about it. So I don't really feel I have to justify what I'm saying here. I'm just telling people that they have to be conscious of the consequences. So I'm not telling people not to do it. I'm just saying enter into it with your eyes open. Now, for example, one of the things that's wrong with this country at the moment, one of the many things, is that what Caroline has just described, that the mere fact that a hate crime report has been made against you will be recorded and held as information, even if there's no prosecution. Now, in England, as a result of a judicial review, they can't do that. And Police Scotland are supposed to be reviewing their procedures. So I was very careful in what I said. I didn't say don't do it, be mindful of the consequences. Now, if the police come to your door, there are certain information that you have to give the police. I think it's your name, your date of birth, and your address. They'll probably ask you to go with them voluntarily. You don't have to do that. If you're arrested, you do have to go with them. But you're entitled, under Scots law, you're entitled to have the advice of a solicitor before you say anything to the police beyond your name, address, and date of birth. And if you can't afford a solicitor will be provided for you. There's always a solicitor on duty who can be called, and you will get legal aid for that initial interview, and the solicitor will probably advise you to say no comment throughout. That is the likelihood. And you can read about these sort of rights if you look at CAB and other websites in Scotland. So I'm not telling people to sit down and coorie down and be all polite and nice. I'm not saying don't exercise your right to freedom of expression. I'm just saying being mindful of the potential consequences depending on what you say. And of course, safety in numbers and organised protest is probably the way to go about it. And I know lots of people are talking about that at the moment. And I suppose, because as a politician, anything I say at this meeting will no doubt be reported by somebody in public, and I don't necessarily mean the people here. I'm not arguing in favour of hate. When I was a prosecutor, I prepared and prosecuted cases where there was a hate crime aggravator. But many people are using the word hate loosely these days. For example, politicians, including the Member of Parliament for the seat, referred to the LGB Alliance as a hate group for years. And we now know from the Charities Commission they're not a hate group and they have the right to be a charity. And so I think, and I raised this in Parliament recently when they brought in the extremist legislation, the way politicians are casually throwing around the word hate, in the same way that trans rights activists may throw around the word unsafe. It is not hateful to disagree with someone. It doesn't make you unsafe if I disagree with you. So that's my position. So I'm not saying don't protest, don't exercise your right to freedom of speech. I'm just saying be mindful and be prepared for potential consequences. That's really all.
Thank you, Joanne. And while it may never get to court, I think it's important to be mindful, as Lisa Mackenzie had said, the process is the punishment. And that's, I think, really important that we remember that. I'm still going to say that you can't change sex and that lesbians don't do dick, because that's the truth. And it's going to be interesting. It's going to be really interesting when you make an oath in court to tell the truth. There's a huge conflict. So I don't feel I've got an awful lot to lose. My daughters are older now, and I just have no more fucks left to give. But there are people that stand to lose an awful lot, and I think that's what the spirit in which Joanna was speaking. Okay. I don't know if that's working.
Just a short arse.
Maybe, oh no, it's on.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to say, let's be cautious about the optics, though, because trans rights activists love to be the victim, and we can't make this into an opportunity for them to say, well, look at all the hate flowing towards us. So I think it's absolutely right that people, you say, yeah, you can't change sex, and, lots of things that are really factual, but it would also be tempting to push the boundaries and say things which, if taken in isolation, could be seen as, could be considered hateful. So I'm just cautioning about not, just as this is becoming more widely understood by the public, that not the first thing they see is a wave of women saying nasty things about trans people, which... So I just think it's a fine balance, and we just need to keep our heads, because we're just about to win it, and you don't want to blow it by making a misstep. That's all.
Thank you. I think that's very eminently sensible, and I personally will be very cautious about how I phrase my objections, because I learned from Joan. So thank you, Joan. Time is ticking on, and I'm going to finish on this next question.
Caroline, one more question.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'm from the Scottish Union for Education, and I think it's really important that we don't underestimate to what extent institutional capture that Joanne talked about has taken place, because for me this isn't a legal battle or even a politician's battle. We already know that most local authority education committees are captured. Most head teachers have only been employed because they sing from the same song sheet as government. And they have already pushed out a whole generation of mainly women teachers over the age of 50 who wanted to teach knowledge rather than gender ideology. And so I think, I don't know, like advice really, we will be encouraging our members to argue that schools should not be pushing the Hate Crime Act. They should not be promoting the hate monster, which I think is directed towards children and young people. And I think we can have a campaign outside the political and judicial framework, which is ordinary people going to their schools and saying we don't want our kids to be taught about hate or ideology, because it's not a useful way. It's divisive and it's destructive. And actually just get on and educate our kids.
Thank you. Absolutely. So our final question, and it's to all of the panelists, and it's controversial. And I'm more than happy to start with my answer. The question is, to each member, is the GRA fit for purpose? Would you support its repeal? And my answer is yes, I would support its repeal, because I think while that legislation is on the statute books, we are incredibly vulnerable, our rights are incredibly vulnerable. And I say that not because I want trans people to have less rights, quite the opposite, but I think that trans people could be protected under the protected characteristic gender reassignment. And that would ensure that they wouldn't be discriminated because they are trans individuals. However, I think the whole time that the GRA is on the statute books, that women's rights are very vulnerable. Thank you.
Yes, I would support its repeal. And I think if you look at the history of when it was introduced back in 2004, the argument, there was no same-sex marriage at that point, and we lived in a really homophobic society. There was no plan for same-sex marriage either, and I think the arguments of the people who were advancing the GRA were framed around people who were long-term transsexuals who wished to marry their partner. That was the argument for it. And then as it started going through Westminster, it was amended in lots of different ways, so it became basically you could self-identify. You didn't have to have any medical procedure in order to get a gender recognition certificate, which is something that people still don't really understand, I don't think. I'm not a politician anymore, so I don't have to frame my arguments under be kind anymore. I don't think people can change sex. I think it's actually a sexist, homophobic piece of legislation, and I would support its repeal, yeah.
I'm not a politician any longer either, fortunately for everybody and for their stress levels when I get stressed. I think that my only concern about how it's perceived, I think the GRR has to be amended and probably amended out of its natural existence. But whether the campaign then becomes, we want to get rid of the GRA, it becomes a different argument. I think we need to be arguing positively. I mean, I'm a child of the 70s, you know. We had David Bowie and Mark Bolan and everything else. You know, the idea that gender non-conformity was something that had to be medicalised or defined in law just seems madness. I mean, I suppose my argument is we win this argument when we win the argument about its impacts on women, and you then legislate accordingly. Whether it, you know, is the legislation itself causing harm? Is it out of date now because the world has moved on? I think these are all persuadable arguments, but I think we have to argue in terms of women's rights. And also, it goes back to my point earlier about language. I know there are people who are pressing to define in law and clarify the Equality Act when it talks about sex, it means biological sex. The reason it doesn't say that in the Equality Act is because nobody imagined it would mean anything else. So we have to, that is the way in which language is used. It's the fact that, you know, I regard myself as somebody who pays attention on feminist issues and women's issues, and it's when I noticed Joan McAlpine giving Hamza Yusuf a bad time about something in the Parliament that I paid attention to something that had actually almost gone beyond when people pointed, well, I don't know why you've got a problem now. You know, the Trojan horse politics of bringing something in and then pointing back to it and asking people why they complain. So this sounds like a very long answer to what's demanding a short question. I think we need to talk about the politics of the GRR. If that ends up meaning that we're getting rid of it, then fine. If we define and protect people's rights in different ways, fine. But actually I think it needs to be, the focus needs to be on what's happening to women and the risk placed on women and the way that we're not talking about women. And I think just my final point of what's said about schools, my only confidence in what's happening in schools is elsewhere is what we saw in the GRR as it passed through the Parliament. I would say probably about 20 MSPs at most really believed it. Most people thought that somebody else believed it, or they thought that tactically it was in their interest, or they thought the lobbying group was really strong. So I think the support for all of this is paper thin, and therefore we have to do a job to make sure that people will listen to us. And I suppose my fear is if we focus simply on the repeal of the GRA, we end up pulling the argument back onto territory where it's more difficult and away from the territory, the common sense world where people look at a guy with leggings on and know that he shouldn't be in a women's jail.
Right. Well, I think the 2004 Gender Recognition Act is a flawed piece of legislation in terms of legislative drafting, but I won't be campaigning for its repeal. It was passed to bring the domestic law of the United Kingdom into line with what was required by the European Court of Human Rights. And quite frankly, if I were to campaign for the support of for the repeal of the Gender Recognition Act, I would be open to the charge that I was seeking to move trans rights backwards, and I've never wanted to do that. I've always said that I believe that trans people should have equal rights with the rest of us, and they do under the Equality Act. And equally, I believe there should be a legal process to recognise that some people want to live in the opposite gender. I don't think people can change sex, but I think with proper safeguards, the procedure is there, and it was brought, the legislation was passed to bring us into line with the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights. And as chair of the Joint Committee on Human Rights at Westminster, I'm certainly not going to support repealing legislation which is there as a result of the European Court of Human Rights.
Yeah, so if you saw us conferring while Johann Lamont was speaking, that's what we were talking about. I remember that during the GRR, one of the really what I consider to be the important interventions that many of you might remember was the UN Special Rapporteur for Violence Against Women and Girls, Regan Al-Salam, and during her contribution to, well, it was quite a stacked and biased it was a committee session that they'd hastily convened, which felt like in the middle of the night to eventually take her evidence. She made the point very clearly that one of the main arguments against self-ID was that as long as you had a system in place that was compliant in the way that Joanna has just described, that you didn't need to have self-ID, but you did need to have a way to recognize that. So I think being part of that system as we are, I would be the same. I don't think I would be campaigning to repeal it, although I'm very sympathetic to those that, you know, take that stance and feel that way themselves.
Thanks, Ash. So that brings us to the end of this session. Yeah, I should never put notes on my phone because I'm a bit of a technophobe. Anyway, thanks for listening and thanks for participating and for your questions, and a special thank you to our 4 panel members. We've heard an awful lot today about women's issues, which is great because it tends to be just at these events that we hear about women's issues, that women are actually centred, which is a great shame, and I do wonder if society would be better if women's rights and women's issues were more commonplace, they were dealt with more commonly and consistently across our media, whether that be legacy media or social media. But one thing today we heard, which is always really striking, is about the commodification and degradation that women in the porn industry are subjected to. And I just want to say today, and make it crystal clear, we are not objects. We are not human shields, and we are not, definitely not, guinea pigs to teach men how to be women, especially vulnerable women in prison who seem to have little or no representation. And that means that we need to speak up for the voiceless, those of us who can. I do appreciate that there are people in this room that have to be anonymous, and there is no judgment on my part on that, none whatsoever. But those of us who can speak up, we need to speak up. With a few honourable exceptions, 4 of them sat on our panel today, our elected representatives have repeatedly failed us. Now, I'm big enough to stand up for myself, and let me tell the younger members of the audience, one good thing about getting older is it is really liberating. And I'm sure there are many women in this room that would agree with that. But I have 2 daughters, and I worry for them. I worry for the society that they're grown up in, and I worry for your daughters and your nieces. Because I don't want my daughters to grow up in a society where women, and especially lesbians, are gaslit, where girls and young women are expected to be okay with the erosion of their rights just because creepy middle-aged men demand it. That's not a criticism of young women. I don't criticise young women because I recall how powerful peer pressure is. We know that there is an intolerant bunch waiting in the wings, ready to pounce on any woman, regardless of age, who deviates from the dogma. And that can be hard when you're young. That can be really hard when you're young. And then they tell us that we're supposed to accept this as inclusive and progressive. Right. My English teacher, I think, would seriously object to some interpretation of those words, because there is nothing inclusive or progressive about coercing half the nation into a dogma that's, quite frankly, I find a bit batshit crazy. And I hope, on a more positive note, after listening to the fantastic speakers today, that women here feel empowered and emboldened, and going forward that you maybe consider accessing some of the democratic processes that we are there. It doesn't need to be in politics. Women's Aid have boards, Rape Crisis have boards, there are lots of organisations out there, and I know of some brave women who have even attempted to join the Engender Board. But wherever possible, if you feel that you would like to join a board or become more active, talk to other women, develop little groups of support, and those of you who are contemplating that, I wish you well, and I'm getting a sign to shut up. So I'm going to shut up, and I hope that you've enjoyed your day, and we're moving on to our final session. Thank you.